The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a spring morning that could not have been more promising. A light honeyed sun filtered through the budding leaves, casting delicate shadows across the cobbled streets and the neat hedgerows lining each garden. Birds trilled as if rehearsing for a festival, and the faint scent of freshly turned earth mingled with the aroma of blossoms that clung stubbornly to their branches. It was precisely the kind of morning that encouraged the village to appear at its very best, and Lady Clematis Godfrey, renowned for her exacting taste, had ensured that St. Mary Mead would do her credit. The Vicarage garden, normally a sanctuary of quiet reflection, had been transformed into a tableau of sociability. White linen tablecloths adorned small tables, silver tea services gleamed in the sunlight, and bouquets of lilac and daffodil stood at attention as if on ceremony. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the occasional clink of china. A harmony that suggested harmony itself reigned in this peaceful village. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, there simmered an undercurrent of rivalry, jealousy, and carefully concealed resentment. Miss Marple, perched in the shade of a lilac bush that seemed to embrace her slight frame like an old friend, observed it all with quiet scrutiny. She did not raise her eyes from the embroidery she pretended to attend to, though her sharp gaze wandered ceaselessly, cataloguing details unnoticed by others. She noted the way Mrs. Price Hargreaves, the vicar's well-meaning but eternally flustered housekeeper, fussed over the arrangement of scones, insisting that each plate be perfectly symmetrical. She watched young Nicholas Gillingham, recently returned from London, lean too close to the vicar's daughter, Lucy, as though eager to impress her with tales of the city's wonders. And she marked the subtle tension in Lady Godfrey's smile, which carried a tightness only those acquainted with her knew, a carefully polished mask, hiding the faintest trace of irritation. Miss Marple. "Do join us for tea," Lady Godfrey called, her voice brittle yet polished. "One cannot sit in a corner while the world passes by." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, but made no move to rise. She preferred observation to interruption, understanding that true knowledge often came to those who waited. The villagers began arriving in earnest. Mr. and Mrs. Swanton, fresh from their morning errands, displayed their usual air of self-importance. Mrs. Swanton, in particular, had evidently discovered a new method of delivering subtle rebukes through her tone, which she wielded with a precision born of decades of practice. Dr. Haydock, ever punctual, made a point of inspecting the arrangement of the flowers as if he were checking their health, while his wife fussed with her hat, tugging at it repeatedly in mild frustration. For a brief moment, the garden seemed to embody the epitome of English civility: polite smiles, genteel laughter, and the faint rustle of silk skirts on well-mown lawns. And then, as if the harmony could not endure the pretense any longer, a sharp scream shattered the calm. It came from the far end of the garden, near the Vicarage Gate, where the hedges arched over a narrow path leading to the street. Miss Marple's keen ears picked up the shrillness of the cry immediately, and she rose slowly, steady as a shadow. Others turned as well, some curious, some alarmed, but none as attuned to human expression as she. The source of the commotion was quickly revealed: Mr. Gerald Cartwright, the wealthy and somewhat arrogant new resident of the village, lay sprawled across the cobblestones. His eyes, wide with terror, stared sightlessly at the morning sky. A crimson stain spread across his chest, stark and undeniable against the soft hues of spring. His walking stick lay discarded beside him, a silent testament to the violence that had interrupted the serenity of the day. The villagers reacted with a mixture of horror and frantic energy. Mrs. Price Hargreaves rushed forward, wringing her hands, while Dr. Haydock bent over the victim with professional urgency. "Dead," he pronounced, almost as if testing the word on his tongue before acknowledging it fully. "No pulse. Quick, fetch the constable." In the midst of the panic, Miss Marple remained unusually calm. She knelt beside Mr. Cartwright, her eyes scanning not the obvious tragedy but the subtler signs: the angle of the body, the position of the hands, the faint marks on his collar. Her mind, as always, began to sort through the possibilities, noting what was strange, what was ordinary, and what did not fit at all. A low murmur rose from the gathered crowd. "Who could have done this?" someone whispered, and the question rippled through the group like a stone thrown into still water. Each face seemed to harbor a hidden thought, a suspicion not voiced aloud. Miss Marple's gaze swept over them, cataloguing nuances: the twitch of a lip, the slight avoidance of eye contact, the too careful attention to others' behavior. The vicar, pale but composed, arrived at the scene. "This is a terrible shock," he said, his voice steady despite the horror around him. "We must summon the authorities at once. The constable will need to take statements immediately." And so the peaceful morning of St. Mary Mead, with its promise of tea and gentle conversation, was irrevocably broken. The garden party had become a crime scene, and the gentle rhythms of village life were suspended by the sudden intrusion of death. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her hat with deliberate care, and her eyes met Lady Godfrey's. There was no need for words. She understood, as did the older lady, that the day would be remembered not for its blooms or its laughter, but for the mystery that had silently crept in through the Vicarage Gate. The news of Mr. Gerald Cartwright's death spread through St. Mary Mead with astonishing speed. By mid-morning, whispers floated through the village like autumn leaves caught on a sudden gust of wind. In the bakery, Mrs. Hopper's hands trembled as she kneaded dough, murmuring, "Such a dreadful thing." Right by the Vicarage Gate, of all places, customers leaned in, sharing their theories with equal parts fascination and horror, while young Emily Pritchard peeked through the window at the scene beyond, wide-eyed and pale. Miss Marple, having remained by the vicarage garden longer than most, now walked quietly toward the small square where news travelled fastest. She took in the reactions with her usual calm scrutiny. Each expression, each twitch of a smile or frown told a story. Some villagers wore masks of concern that barely concealed their relief at not being the victim. Others, more subtly, seemed almost disappointed, a hint of curiosity shining through their grief. "It's simply unimaginable," Mrs. Swanton whispered to her companion, Mrs. Codrington, as they passed by, their voices barely audible above the hum of conversation. "I simply cannot believe anyone here would do such a thing. St. Mary Mead has always been so quiet." Miss Marple's eyes twitched slightly at the word quiet. Villages, she had long observed, were never truly quiet. They were reservoirs of petty rivalries, old grudges, and unspoken secrets. Often it was precisely the seemingly peaceful places where the darkest impulses festered. The vicar, having returned briefly to the rectory to speak with the constable, emerged with a look of composed urgency. Constable Keeble, a young man with earnest eyes and an almost nervous rigidity, attempted to restore a sense of order among the gathered villagers. "Please, everyone, remain calm," he urged. "Statements will be taken in an orderly fashion. No one is to leave the village until we have spoken with everyone present." A murmur of discontent followed. No one liked being told to wait, especially when curiosity burned brighter than fear. Miss Marple observed this with mild interest. People always revealed more in impatience than in cooperation. By mid-morning, the usual social hierarchy of St. Mary Mead began to manifest in the villagers' reactions. Lady Godfrey, as hostess of the ill-fated garden party, moved among the crowd with careful poise, masking her irritation at the disruption of her perfectly curated morning. Her smile, practiced and even, betrayed the faintest tension as she whispered reassurance to the vicar and Mrs. Price Hargreaves. The younger generation, including Nicholas Gillingham, Lucy Vicar, and the various children of the village, clustered together in a mixture of fascination and fear. "Do you think anyone in the village could really do such a thing?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched her mother's hand. Nicholas's confident smile faltered, revealing a hint of uncertainty. I suppose anyone could," he admitted, though even he found the notion uncomfortable. Older villagers, those accustomed to reading the subtleties of human behavior, exchanged meaningful glances. Miss Marple, quietly joining them near the fountain in the square, noted the almost imperceptible reactions, the nervous clearing of throats, the shifting of weight from one foot to another, the avoidance of prolonged eye contact. Even in their shock they were performing, revealing hints of character and hidden thought. "I cannot imagine who would want to harm Mr. Cartwright," Mr. Swanton muttered, adjusting his spectacles as though by scrutinizing the crowd he might deduce a clue. "He seemed rather, well, agreeable enough." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Agreeable enough, yes, but sometimes those who appeared the most innocuous were merely skilled at hiding ambition, resentment, or pride." She made a mental note of the villagers' assessments, filing each away for future reference. Meanwhile, gossip, as it inevitably does, began to mutate facts into speculation. Some insisted Mr. Cartwright had argued with the vicar the previous week over trivial matters. Others claimed he had been seen exchanging heated words with a tradesman near the marketplace. Every whisper carried its own blend of truth, exaggeration, and invention. Miss Marple listened, not with disbelief, but with the practiced discernment of someone accustomed to separating the signal from the noise. Even in this seemingly chaotic swirl, subtle patterns emerged. Certain villagers avoided mentioning others, hinting at unresolved tensions or perhaps unacknowledged fear. Others insisted on embellishing the narrative, either to assert control or to disguise their own vulnerabilities. Miss Marple catalogued it all, the gestures, the pauses, the little slips of language that betrayed true thoughts. By noon, the village square had taken on the appearance of a carefully staged scene from which the detective mind could extract clues. There were whispers of old grievances, a property dispute here, a long-forgotten slight there. The connections between people, invisible on ordinary days, seemed to ripple outward with new significance now that death had intruded. Miss Marple's eyes, calm yet probing, traced every interaction, noting which villagers sought to dominate the conversation and which sought to disappear into the background. The arrival of the newspaper reporter added a new layer of complexity. Armed with a notebook and a notepad of preconceptions, he prodded villagers for sensational remarks, often twisting their words into slightly exaggerated versions of themselves. Miss Marple observed him with mild curiosity. He would leave more clues than he uncovered, revealing character through his persistent misinterpretation of social cues. Through it all, Miss Marple remained an almost invisible presence, smiling, nodding, occasionally offering a mild remark about the tea or the weather. She spoke only when necessary, allowing the villagers' own thoughts and actions to speak for them. In her mind, the beginnings of the puzzle were already forming. Every fear, every boast, every slip of attention was a piece, and though the picture remained incomplete, she could feel the shape of it emerging. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the village's panic began to settle into a nervous, anticipatory quiet. The constable continued to take statements, the vicar offered prayers of consolation, and Lady Godfrey circulated with polite insistence that everything would return to normal. Yet Miss Marple knew that normalcy was a fragile facade. Beneath the teacups and polite smiles, the human heart revealed its secrets, and it was only a matter of time before they would emerge in full. Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves and straightening her hat, decided it was time to listen more carefully, not to speak. After all, in St. Mary Mead, the answers to the gravest questions were never shouted. They were whispered, hinted at, and revealed only to those patient enough to observe. By mid-afternoon, the initial shock of Mr. Cartwright's death had begun to settle into a tense, expectant quiet in St. Mary Mead. The Vicarage garden, once the scene of cheerful social gathering, was now cordoned off with polite rope barriers, and the constable meticulously questioned those who had been present. Miss Marple, as always, observed from a discreet distance, her keen eyes following the flow of human behavior rather than the surface facts of the crime. The first statements had already revealed fragments of truth, mixed with errors of perception and conjecture. Mrs. Price Hargreaves, for instance, insisted she had not seen a thing, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease whenever Nicholas Gillingham passed by. Miss Marple noted this subtle reaction. Mrs. Price Hargreaves had the habit of watching people as much as the objects they handled, a detail not lost on an experienced observer. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had spoken gravely of Mr. Cartwright's wounds to the constable. A precise blow delivered with intention, he had said. This was no accident. His words, though factual, revealed nothing of motive. Miss Marple, silently cataloguing his manner, noticed the slight hesitation when he mentioned the angle of the wound. Some professional pride, yes, but perhaps also a subtle awareness of social discomfort. He was reluctant to cast judgment too freely in a village already reeling from scandal. She moved slowly along the edge of the garden, glancing at each figure, observing habits and expressions. The villagers responded to her presence with polite acknowledgement, rarely aware of the scrutiny they were under. There was a peculiar honesty in people who did not know they were being watched. Mrs. Swanton, for example, made repeated small gestures toward her jewelry, as if unconsciously asserting her status. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered over her pearls when speaking of the deceased, suggesting a subtle envy, or perhaps a lingering sense of competition. Nicholas Gillingham, eager to display confidence, wandered too close to the scene where the constable was examining the cobblestones. His eyes darted toward Lucy Vicar, then away, betraying an internal conflict, a desire to impress her while masking unease. Miss Marple filed this away silently. Young men often revealed more than they intended, particularly in moments of stress. Lady Godfrey, though outwardly composed, betrayed tension in the set of her shoulders and the slightly forced lilt in her voice when she conversed with other villagers. She was a master of social control, yet the sudden intrusion of murder into her carefully ordered world had exposed cracks in her usually polished facade. Miss Marple observed without judgment how these cracks might serve as windows into deeper truths. The constable, meanwhile, appeared increasingly flustered by the number of witnesses and the conflicting statements they provided. He asked each villager to recount their movements during the critical minutes, but as always, human memory proved unreliable. Mrs. Codrington's recollection differed from Mrs. Swanton's, even regarding trivial details such as the arrangement of the teacups. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She knew well that these small inconsistencies often revealed more than they concealed. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple noticed a curious detail. A faint smear of dirt on the gate-post at the edge of the garden, easily overlooked, had been brushed away by none of the officials. It suggested that someone had passed through in haste, or perhaps that someone had tried to disguise the direction of their departure. Most villagers, focused on gossip and speculation, would never notice. Miss Marple, however, recorded it with the patience of a weaver noting each thread before beginning a tapestry. She also took note of the interpersonal dynamics among the witnesses. Mrs. Price Hargreaves, though outwardly dutiful, glanced repeatedly at Lady Godfrey, as if expecting guidance on what to reveal. Nicholas Gillingham and Lucy Vicar exchanged furtive looks, carefully measured as though a secret too fragile to speak aloud existed between them. Even Dr. Haydock, typically reserved, allowed a subtle, almost imperceptible frown when recounting the moment he arrived at the gate. Each nuance, each hesitation was a clue. Each reaction, a potential thread to follow. The constable, frustrated by the slow pace of cooperation, suggested taking everyone to the station for questioning. Lady Godfrey, ever mindful of appearances, demurred politely. There is no need to alarm the villagers further. Surely a careful inquiry here will suffice. Miss Marple understood the subtext. Lady Godfrey wished to maintain control over the narrative, to keep the scandal contained. Yet even she could not fully prevent human nature from revealing itself. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple seated herself once more beneath the shade of a lilac bush, observing quietly. She watched how fear, curiosity, and self-interest shaped each individual's behavior. There was an artistry in human reaction that no forensic examination could replicate. A slip of the tongue, a fleeting expression, a hand brushing nervously over a chest pocket. These were the true indicators of motive, opportunity, and conscience. A sudden argument broke out between two villagers over the placement of the flowers near the gate. Miss Marple's eyes twitched in quiet amusement. The dispute, trivial though it seemed, revealed more than either party intended about their character. One sought control, the other approval, and both exposed the subtle hierarchy of influence in the village. By the time the vicar suggested breaking for a late tea, the day had become a carefully orchestrated observation of human nature. The constable had recorded statements, the villagers had displayed their prejudices and alliances, and Miss Marple had collected the first faint outlines of a pattern. She sipped her tea with deliberate composure, reflecting that while the police focused on facts and procedures, it was often in the unnoticed details, the slight hesitations, the concealed gestures, the unconscious expressions, that the truth of a crime resided. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Miss Marple rose, her mind alive with quiet calculation. She knew the day's proceedings were only the beginning. The real puzzle, the one that would reveal the human motives behind this violent act, would require patience, subtlety, and keen observation. And she, as always, was prepared to wait. By the following morning, The events at the Vicarage Gate had become the dominant topic in St. Mary Mead. Doors opened to confessional whispers, tea was poured with nervous hands, and every street corner bore the unmistakable hum of speculation. Miss Marple, however, remained serene, her observations deliberate and unobtrusive. While the villagers indulged in conjecture, she focused on what they revealed about themselves. Constable Keeble had already identified a prime suspect in the matter of Mr. Cartwright's death. It was a young man, Peter Thorne, a gardener who had recently arrived in the village, his past largely unknown to all but a few. Peter had been seen lingering near the Vicarage Gate on the morning of the incident, and several villagers claimed to have noticed him acting nervously in the minutes preceding the tragedy. He was acting strangely, Mrs. Codrington declared, her voice high and precise, fidgeting with his gloves, looking this way and that, as though he expected something or someone. Yes, and he walked quickly away right after. Well, after it happened, added Mr. Swanton, adjusting his spectacles with an air of certainty that invited agreement. I saw him, I did. I cannot be mistaken. Miss Marple, who had observed Peter that morning, noted the nervous energy described by the witnesses. It was true, but the context differed. Peter had been on his way to tend the flower beds at the vicarage, a task he performed with diligence, and the hurry was in part due to the pressing schedule rather than any sinister motive. Yet, as always, perception was a powerful force in a small village. Constable Keeble, eager to close the case, visited Peter at his modest lodging. The young man, pale and visibly distressed, protested his innocence with a combination of honesty and confusion. I swear I had nothing to do with it, he insisted. I was tending the garden. I didn't even see anything until I heard the scream. The villagers, however, were less inclined to extend belief. Gossip had already spun its web, and Peter's recent arrival made him a convenient repository for suspicion. Miss Marple, listening from a respectful distance as the constable took notes, found the scene both predictable and revealing. People, when frightened, sought immediate explanations, and the unfamiliar or socially distant were the first to bear the weight of their fear. She noted as well the reactions of those closest to the vicarage. Lady Godfrey, while outwardly expressing sympathy for Peter, exhibited subtle tension in her posture and manner. Her fingers, drumming lightly on the back of a chair, betrayed unease that Miss Marple recognized, the fear that the scandal might touch her own carefully maintained reputation. Mrs. Price Hargreaves, meanwhile, moved about the household with heightened alertness, her glances toward the new gardener, shadowed with a faint doubt, tempered by professional politeness. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human expression, did not dismiss Peter entirely, nor did she accept the villagers' immediate conclusions. She understood the danger of allowing fear and rumor to dictate judgment. Yet there was a subtle detail she could not ignore. Peter's gloves bore a faint smudge of soil, different from the flower beds he tended, though it was unclear whether it was fresh or residual. It was too minor a clue to convict anyone, but enough to pique her attention. As the morning progressed, other potential suspects emerged, mostly through social connections rather than evidence. Nicholas Gillingham, whose presence near Lucy Vicar had been noted by several onlookers, was questioned by the constable for his proximity to the scene. Though he insisted he had been returning from the marketplace, his defensive posture suggested he was uncomfortable with scrutiny. Miss Marple, observing from a corner, realized that his agitation stemmed less from guilt and more from an acute awareness of social expectations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Swanton had begun quietly recounting an old grievance to anyone who would listen, a dispute between Mr. Cartwright and the Swanton family regarding a parcel of land on the village outskirts. Though framed as a minor disagreement, the story carried undertones of lingering resentment, and Miss Marple filed it away for future consideration. Old grudges, she had long known, often played a role in conflicts where reason alone could not explain behavior. Dr. Haydock, concerned for the integrity of the investigation, had suggested the constable expand the inquiry to include former acquaintances of Mr. Cartwright, people who might have harbored hidden motives. Yet the logistics of a village investigation often demanded shortcuts, and with Peter already under suspicion, the constable's focus was narrowed. Miss Marple recognized this as an opportunity. When authorities concentrate on the obvious, Subtle truths often remain unnoticed. By late morning, the Vicarage Gate had become the focal point of village discussion, its shadow stretching across conversations like a silent witness. Miss Marple noticed patterns forming, who avoided certain topics, who repeated gossip with slight embellishments, who sought to redirect attention. These small, easily overlooked behaviors were, in her estimation, far more telling than any hurried confession or eyewitness account. As tea was served at the vicarage, Peter sat quietly, accepting a cup with hands that trembled slightly, a blend of nervousness and polite submission. The villagers watched him with suspicion, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, fear, and judgment. Miss Marple poured her own tea, listening without comment, allowing him to speak and reveal himself naturally. Peter's words were halting but sincere. "I wish to help," he said quietly. "I can explain anything you like, though I assure you I am innocent. I did not even know him well, let alone wish him harm." Miss Marple observed his tone and his gestures. There was no malice in his eyes, and the nervous repetition of phrases suggested honesty, though shaken by circumstance. Yet she did not speak, for she knew that truth often required more than words. It required observation, reflection, and patience. By the afternoon, Peter had been questioned multiple times, and the villagers began to grow restless with a sense of resolution forming too quickly. Their attention, focused narrowly on the new gardener, created a backdrop against which subtler, less obvious details could escape notice. Miss Marple, aware of this, felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The first suspects had been identified, the obvious threads had been drawn, and the real work, the unearthing of hidden motives, was only beginning. In the quiet of the vicarage garden, Miss Marple reflected on the early investigation. Peter Thorne, though convenient as a suspect, had the look of a man unfairly caught in the web of circumstance, and the villagers, in their eagerness for resolution, were revealing more about themselves than about the crime. Soon she knew the true culprit would emerge, not through haste or accusation, but through the careful unraveling of human nature itself. By mid-afternoon, the vicarage garden had regained a semblance of calm, though an undercurrent of tension lingered like mist. The constable had completed his initial rounds of questioning, and Peter Thorne remained under polite observation, a convenient focal point for suspicion. Yet Miss Marple's attention had shifted elsewhere, toward the subtler details that most villagers overlooked. It was a small thing, almost laughably insignificant. That first caught her eye, a scrap of paper tucked beneath a flower pot near the vicarage gate. While the constable and the villagers concentrated on statements and alibis, Miss Marple noticed its corner peeking out, as if shyly inviting her attention. She picked it up carefully, noting its edges were slightly frayed, and unfolded it to reveal a brief, hastily scribbled message. "Meet me by the old elm at noon. Come alone." To anyone else, the note might have seemed trivial or even irrelevant, but Miss Marple's mind, trained by years of quiet observation, immediately registered its significance. It suggested premeditation, a secret meeting, and perhaps most importantly, the involvement of someone familiar with the vicarage layout, someone confident enough to leave such a message in plain sight, yet subtle enough to assume it might not be found. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and slipped it into her reticule, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. The flower pot itself had been slightly moved, indicating that someone had retrieved the note earlier or replaced it in haste. She observed the soil, slightly disturbed, though not recently watered, suggesting the movement had occurred in the last 24 hours. As she pondered the implications, villagers drifted by, their expressions alternating between curiosity and unease. Mrs. Price Hargreaves fussed over the remaining teacups, Mrs. Swanton muttered about decorum, and Nicholas Gillingham hovered near Lucy Vicar, attempting to maintain appearances. None of them noticed the note, nor did they see the subtle tension radiating from the vicar himself as he moved quietly among his guests. Miss Marple's knowledge of human behavior allowed her to infer more than their words ever could. The vicar, while polite and composed, exhibited a slight nervousness whenever the vicarage gate was mentioned. A faint crease formed between his brows, and his hands unconsciously adjusted the collar of his jacket. Miss Marple filed these observations with the same care she gave to the physical evidence. Often, It was not what was done but what was avoided that revealed the most. She also took note of Lady Godfrey, who had insisted on maintaining order during the garden party, despite the tragedy. Her outward composure concealed an underlying unease, evidenced by the way she fingered the edge of her gloves when speaking to other villagers. There was a tension in her manner, as though she feared a hidden truth might emerge to disrupt her carefully maintained social balance. Miss Marple's attention returned to the note. It seemed almost innocuous, yet she sensed that it might be the key to understanding the chain of events leading to Mr. Cartwright's death. Someone had orchestrated a secret meeting, someone who likely held a grievance or ambition strong enough to escalate to violence, and the choice of the Old Elm as a rendezvous point hinted at a familiarity with the village's secluded areas, places not often noticed by casual observers. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking past the Old Elm herself, ostensibly to enjoy the gentle warmth of the spring sun. The tree stood near the edge of the common, its broad branches casting a dappled shade over a patch of grass still slightly damp from morning dew. She examined the ground carefully, noticing a faint indentation in the soil, as if someone had stood there recently. The leaves were undisturbed beyond that, suggesting a single presence had passed this way. Perhaps the person who had left the note. Perhaps the killer. While inspecting the area, she overheard a conversation between two villagers discussing Mr. Cartwright's temperament. He had a sharp tongue, one whispered. Made enemies easily, though few would admit it. Miss Marple nodded internally. She had long known that people like Mr. Cartwright, whose arrogance masked insecurities, often became targets of resentment. Yet resentment alone rarely led to murder. Opportunity, secrecy, and cunning were required, and the note suggested all three. Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple observed Peter Thorne again. He moved quietly, careful not to draw attention, yet Miss Marple noticed his gaze occasionally flicker toward the Old Elm. She made a mental note of the subtle reaction. It was too cautious to be simple curiosity, too fleeting to be obvious guilt. Something about the tree, or perhaps what it represented, had registered with him, though he had said nothing. In the late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple convened a brief private moment with the vicar. A small detail often overlooked, she said gently, producing the note. It may mean nothing, or it may point us to the true sequence of events. One cannot ignore such things, even if they appear trivial. The vicar's eyes widened slightly, though he masked his reaction with a polite nod. I cannot imagine anyone would have left such a note, he admitted, his voice low. Mr. Cartwright. He had acquaintances, yes, but no one I would expect to act in such a way. Indeed, Miss Marple replied quietly. It is often the least expected who conceal the most. The note does not lie, but it does not speak aloud. One must observe what is around it, the footsteps it touches, the paths it crosses, and the faces it does not meet. The constable, distracted by paperwork and the endless stream of villagers eager to share speculation, had missed the note entirely. To him, Peter Thorne remained the obvious suspect, yet Miss Marple already sensed that the story was more intricate than it appeared. Hidden motives, long-buried resentments, and carefully orchestrated deception lay waiting beneath the garden's orderly surface. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a warm glow over the vicarage, Miss Marple folded the note and tucked it safely away. It was a small clue, almost insignificant to those focused on immediate evidence, yet in her mind it had already begun to shift the shape of the investigation. Often, she reflected, it was the smallest detail, overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, that led to the unveiling of the truth, and in St. Mary Mead, a truth far more complex than anyone suspected was quietly taking form. By the following evening, the village of St. Mary Mead had entered a state of restless unease. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, leaving a faint glow that mingled with the soft lamplight spilling from windows. Shadows danced across the cobblestones, and the quiet of the evening was punctuated only by the occasional clatter of shutters or the distant bark of a dog. In homes across the village, villagers whispered in hushed tones, recounting every detail of the morning at the vicarage, each adding their own conjectures and half-remembered stories. Miss Marple, however, moved through this atmosphere with her characteristic calm. The constable had returned to his duties at the station, leaving the investigation's finer nuances to her scrutiny. The day's events had left the villagers both fearful and eager for resolution, and such emotions often encouraged confessions, or at least the revelation of hidden truths. It was Mrs. Price Hargreaves who first revealed a thread of intrigue, though unintentionally. In arranging the tea service for a small evening gathering, she muttered under her breath about the late Mr. Cartwright's persistent inquiries into the vicarage's accounts. Miss Marple, seated nearby and pretending to adjust her gloves, caught the subtle emphasis on persistent and accounts. She filed it away mentally. Financial disputes were often overlooked in favor of more personal motives, yet they could provoke significant resentment. Meanwhile, Nicholas Gillingham and Lucy Vicar had retired to a quiet corner of the parlour. Their conversation, though softly spoken, revealed more than either intended. Nicholas, attempting to sound casual, remarked on Mr. Cartwright's difficult nature, while Lucy hesitated before mentioning a brief altercation she had witnessed weeks prior. The incident, minor to any outsider, had involved a disagreement over the vicarage property boundary. Miss Marple noted the subtle tension between them, recognizing that even small disagreements could leave lasting marks, hidden beneath smiles and polite conversation. Lady Godfrey, ever vigilant of social propriety, circulated among her guests with a practiced air of light-heartedness. Yet beneath the veneer of charm, Miss Marple discerned unease. Lady Godfrey's questions were pointed, designed to elicit information while revealing none in return. There was an unspoken calculation in her gaze, a careful observation of who glanced nervously, who lingered too long on certain topics, and who sought to distract with trivial conversation. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Lady Godfrey's sophistication might hide knowledge, but it could not conceal instinctive responses. It was during this gathering that Mrs. Swanton, never one to conceal her opinions for long, introduced another layer of complication. "I do wonder," she said, voice tinged with speculation, "whether Mr. Cartwright's treatment of the tradesman was entirely proper. I hear he could be demanding." She leaned closer to Mrs. Codrington, emphasizing the word with a sharp glance. Miss Marple noted the subtle implication. Resentment, especially when coupled with perceived injustice, was often fertile ground for conflict. Dr. Haydock, seated somewhat apart from the main circle, appeared lost in thought, though not absent from observation. His frown deepened when certain villagers mentioned Mr. Cartwright's recent conversations regarding property and investments. There was a small but telling twitch of his lips, as though he recognized inconsistencies in their accounts, or detected omissions. Miss Marple quietly recorded this reaction. Even the most measured of men left traces of their perception in gestures that were rarely deliberate. The evening's discussions grew more intense when Peter Thorne was mentioned. Despite his polite assurances, the villagers found it difficult to reconcile their fear with his calm demeanor. Some, like Mrs. Codrington, spoke of his nervous behavior that morning. Others, like Nicholas, defended him, suggesting his presence was merely coincidental. Miss Marple observed the interplay carefully. In moments of uncertainty, people revealed their true alliances, prejudices, and sometimes their latent desires to protect or accuse. A turning point came when Lucy Vicar, encouraged perhaps by youthful candor, mentioned a brief, unexplained disappearance of Mr. Cartwright from the garden party before the fatal incident. "He went near the vicarage's side path," she whispered. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but—" She hesitated, eyes wide with unease. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Every movement, every seemingly trivial decision that day could now be reconsidered in the light of this new information. Miss Marple reflected on the collective portrait forming before her. Villagers with petty rivalries, hidden resentments, and carefully curated appearances. The newcomer, Peter Thorne, a convenient but possibly misjudged focal point, and Mr. Cartwright himself, whose abrasive nature had left traces of irritation and minor conflict in nearly every household. Each fragment of social interaction, each hesitation and glancing look, offered the potential to reveal the truth, if observed with care. As the evening deepened, a subtle tension emerged among the villagers. Casual remarks turned into indirect accusations, and minor grievances previously dormant surfaced with surprising urgency. Miss Marple noticed that those who spoke most loudly often did so to distract attention from their own vulnerabilities, while those who remained silent tended to observe more closely, their expressions betraying what they would not voice. By the time the last of the guests departed, leaving the vicarage in the quiet of night, Miss Marple sat near the fire, reflecting on what she had seen. The web of motives was intricate yet coherent: old grievances, small slights, financial disputes, and subtle interpersonal tensions intertwined to form a landscape in which violence had become conceivable. The hidden note she had discovered earlier now seemed even more significant, its implications weaving through each interaction she had observed. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, her mind already connecting the patterns. She knew the early suspects, the obvious ones, were only the surface. Beneath polite smiles and nervous gestures, the real motives lay concealed, waiting for a subtle misstep to reveal them. In St. Mary Mead, secrets had a habit of emerging when least expected, and she, ever patient and quietly perceptive, would be ready when they did. The night settled over the village like a velvet cloak, yet Miss Marple sensed that the storm of revelation had only just begun. The pieces were moving quietly into place, and the true nature of the crime was soon to emerge, not through confession, but through the intricate dance of human behavior. The following morning dawned cool and clear, yet the tranquility of St. Mary Mead was sharply undercut by a fresh disturbance. A second unexpected incident had occurred overnight, sending ripples of fear through the village and compelling even the most composed residents to reconsider their assumptions. Her valuable silver candelabra, belonging to Lady Godfrey, had vanished from the vicarage's side hall. Though no one had witnessed the theft, its disappearance seemed almost choreographed, precise and deliberate, and its timing, so soon after Mr. Cartwright's death, was impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, who had been walking along the village lanes, observing the early morning routines of the residents, paused at the news. She did not rush to conclusions, but her sharp mind registered the significance immediately. While the candelabra's absence might appear a simple act of theft, the context, the sudden death followed by a disappearance, hinted at orchestration rather than opportunism. Villagers, however, were quick to connect dots without much care for subtlety. Peter Thorne, already under scrutiny for the earlier incident, once again found himself the convenient target. "First the death, now this," Mrs. Swanton exclaimed in the bakery, her voice trembling with indignation. "He was near the house last night, I heard. I cannot imagine it's mere coincidence." Her words drew nods from others who, in their eagerness for resolution, were all too ready to see the newcomer as guilty. Yet Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to other details. The candelabra had been removed with careful precision. No footprints indicated hasty retreat, and no signs of forced entry suggested an external intruder. Whoever had taken it knew the household well and understood how to manipulate the environment to avoid detection. Miss Marple's mind traced the possibilities. Someone with intimate knowledge of Lady Godfrey's routines, someone able to move unnoticed among trusted surroundings. As she arrived at the vicarage later that morning, Miss Marple noted the villagers' reactions. Nicholas Gillingham hovered near Lucy Vicar, both of them casting anxious glances toward Peter Thorne, who maintained a quiet composure despite the renewed suspicion. Lady Godfrey, meanwhile, appeared outwardly collected, though a subtle tightening of her lips betrayed concern. Her carefully maintained social poise masked an inner awareness that this incident could amplify the already escalating scandal. The constable, visibly overwhelmed, attempted to manage the growing tension. "Everyone, please, we must not jump to conclusions," he urged, though his voice lacked the authority to curb the rapid spread of gossip. "We will investigate methodically." Methodically or not, the villagers were eager for immediate answers, their imaginations painting Peter as the consummate culprit. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting which villagers were quick to accuse and which were more circumspect. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple's attention shifted from the obvious suspect to subtle inconsistencies in the villagers' accounts. Lady Godfrey, when asked about the candelabra's location the previous evening, hesitated slightly before answering. "I had placed it here and expected it would remain," she said, her eyes flicking toward the doorway as though recalling something she had omitted. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, a carefully controlled moment, revealing more than words could convey. Then there was Mrs. Price Hargreaves, who mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, that she had seen a figure moving near the hall late in the evening, though she had assumed it was a servant tending to household matters. "I did not think anything of it," she admitted, her voice tinged with embarrassment. Miss Marple filed away this seemingly minor detail, aware that casual assumptions often mask the most significant truths. Miss Marple also reflected on Peter Thorne's behaviour. He had risen early, ostensibly to tend the vicarage gardens, and had been seen near the side hall at times convenient to both the theft and the earlier tragedy. Yet his demeanour suggested anxiety rather than malice. He moved with careful precision, aware of the suspicions surrounding him, yet he avoided opportunities to act without attention. It was behaviour consistent with innocence, strained under the weight of false accusation. Later, a conversation between Nicholas Gillingham and Lady Godfrey introduced an unexpected twist. Nicholas, attempting to rationalize the candelabra's disappearance, mentioned a past dispute between Lady Godfrey and Mr. Cartwright over the vicarage's boundary stones. Lady Godfrey's subtle flinch did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple's keen eyes recorded the reaction, a shadow of unease, a trace of lingering tension, suggesting that financial and personal matters, long buried, might be influencing current events. By mid-afternoon, a new layer of complexity emerged. Lucy Vicar mentioned that she had overheard a whispered argument the previous week between Mr. Cartwright and an unknown visitor. The visitor's voice was unfamiliar, though she recalled the sharpness of the discussion and the mention of a debt owed. Miss Marple, attentive as ever, connected the implications. The argument, the note found near the old elm, and now the theft, all suggested premeditation and a motive extending beyond mere impulse. The villagers, increasingly anxious, began to speculate wildly. Each theory seemed plausible in the swirl of rumour, yet none fit the pattern Miss Marple observed. It was not merely the timing of events that mattered, but the behaviours surrounding them, hesitation, avoidance, and subtle shifts in attention that revealed more than overt actions. Miss Marple retreated briefly to the garden, contemplating the sequence of events. The second incident, far from clarifying the situation, had expanded the mystery. The initial suspicion of Peter Thorne seemed insufficient. The real story lay elsewhere, woven through careful observation and the intricate interplay of human behaviour. As the evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage with a renewed sense of focus. The second twist had not only complicated the investigation, but illuminated the true skill of the perpetrator, subtle manipulation, precise timing, and an understanding of human nature sufficient to mask intentions. She knew the days ahead would require delicate attention, but already threads were forming, threads that would eventually lead to the resolution of both the death and the theft. In St. Mary Mead, appearances continued to deceive, and the villagers, eager for resolution, were themselves part of the unfolding puzzle. Miss Marple, ever patient and quietly perceptive, prepared to follow the threads wherever they might lead. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying a hint of dew that clung to the hedgerows and cobblestones. Miss Marple, as ever, moved, with deliberate calm, her keen eyes absorbing every nuance of the village as she approached the vicarage. After the second incident, the theft of the silver candelabra, her mind had begun to trace the web of connections with increasing clarity. The stage was set, and it was time for a subtle test, one designed not to accuse openly, but to observe the reactions that truth invariably provoked. Miss Marple had decided to invite Peter Thorne for tea, under the guise of reassurance and village hospitality. Peter, visibly relieved at the apparent trust, arrived promptly, carrying his quiet composure like a shield. Miss Marple greeted him, warmly, concealing the undercurrent of scrutiny that would shape the next hour. "Do sit down, Mr. Thorne," she said gently, pouring tea with practiced precision. "It is a curious series of events, is it not? One wonders how such things might unfold in a village where everyone believes they know everyone else." Peter nodded, hands clasped neatly in his lap. "It is overwhelming," he admitted. "I do not understand how things have escalated so quickly. I only wish to help in any way I can." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, It is remarkable how fear and suspicion can cloud judgment. One must observe, however, how people behave when under pressure. Sometimes the smallest reaction reveals the greatest truth. She began with innocuous conversation, remarking on the weather, the growth of the garden, and the subtle changes in village life since the tragedy. Peter responded with calm politeness, careful but honest. Miss Marple, however, was attuned not to the words themselves, but to the nuances, hesitations, glances, and fleeting expressions. After a few moments, she introduced a seemingly casual remark. "I noticed by the old elm a scrap of paper, hastily written, mentioning a meeting at noon. Do you happen to know anything of it?" She lifted her teacup, eyes fixed on Peter with mild curiosity. Peter's hands tightened slightly around his cup. His brow furrowed in thought, and for the briefest moment his composure wavered. "No, I cannot imagine anyone would leave such a thing," he said carefully. His tone was polite but strained, an instinctive reaction to a detail he had already noticed but could not explain. Miss Marple leaned back, eyes soft yet penetrating. "It is remarkable," she mused, "how people notice the smallest things and yet choose to say nothing. Sometimes the silence tells more than the words ever could." Peter's gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly toward the window, then returned to Miss Marple. There was a flicker of something, a hesitation, a subtle tightening around the eyes, that did not escape her notice. She recorded it quietly. His reaction was measured, sincere, yet it betrayed awareness of events beyond what he had admitted. She allowed the conversation to drift, speaking now of minor village disputes, small grievances, and long-forgotten incidents. Peter responded with polite observation, sometimes offering facts, sometimes merely acknowledging her remarks. Each response, however, she catalogued meticulously, comparing the rhythm of his speech with the rhythm of known events, the timing of gestures with the placement of evidence. Then, almost as a thought experiment, Miss Marple introduced another subtle test. "It is curious," she said, lightly stirring her tea, "how sometimes, in the pursuit of a small trinket, perhaps a candelabra, people are capable of surprising cunning. One might even go so far as to orchestrate a distraction, leaving the obvious suspect to be blamed, while the true intentions go unnoticed." Peter's hands clenched lightly under the table. He avoided her gaze for a fraction of a second, then recovered, forcing a polite nod. The reaction was slight, almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple's trained observation detected it instantly. It was not guilt alone, she realized, but a recognition of awareness. He had noticed the orchestration of suspicion, but he himself was innocent. The tea continued, each word measured, each gesture considered. Miss Marple spoke of the note, of footsteps by the elm, and of subtle interactions among the villagers carefully watching his responses. She did not press accusations, nor did she reveal knowledge she had already gathered. Instead, she relied on his instinctive reactions, small tells that could not be faked. Finally, she allowed a pause, letting silence stretch comfortably between them. Peter, sensing no immediate threat, relaxed slightly, though his attentiveness never wavered. Miss Marple leaned back, eyes twinkling gently. "You see," she said softly, "the simplest observations often reveal more than the grandest gestures. One can know the truth not merely by evidence, but by watching how people respond to what they believe is unseen." Peter exhaled quietly, a combination of relief and respect passing across his features. I understand," he said. "I had hoped my presence would not complicate matters further." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm, "you have confirmed much, simply by being yourself." The village, eager to place blame, often overlooks the subtleties that point to the real orchestrator of events, and sometimes it is the least suspected who holds the key. As Peter departed, Miss Marple remained seated, reflecting on what she had observed. The subtle reactions, the imperceptible shifts in posture, the fleeting expressions, all these had confirmed her growing suspicion. The truth lay not with the newcomer, nor with the most visibly anxious, but with someone whose cunning and understanding of human nature allowed them to manipulate events with precision. The pieces were coming together. Miss Marple's quiet test had revealed the faintest tremors of deception, the initial cracks in a carefully maintained facade. And she, patient as ever, would wait for the next moment when these cracks widened, revealing the hidden face of guilt. In St. Mary Mead, the final act of observation had begun. The true culprit would soon reveal themselves, not through confession or accusation, but through the undeniable truth of behavior, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming intellect, would be ready to see it all. The following evening, the vicarage was unusually quiet, a hush settling over the familiar rooms that seemed to magnify every sound. Miss Marple had invited all the principal villagers to tea under the guise of a casual gathering. Yet beneath the polite smiles and delicate teacups, an unspoken tension hummed in the air. Every attendee, Lady Godfrey, Nicholas Gillingham, Lucy Vicar, Mrs. Swanton, and even Peter Thorne felt the weight of expectation. Though none could articulate precisely why, Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with her usual calm composure, allowed the conversation to drift initially toward neutral topics. The spring bloom, the progress of the garden, the daily routines of the village. She observed each subtle movement, each expression, noting who fidgeted, who avoided glances, and who spoke with a faint strain of nervousness. All of these small signals were pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling for days. At last she leaned forward, speaking in her soft, gentle tone, the kind that invited attention without commanding it. "We have all, of course, been discussing recent events," she began, nodding toward Peter Thorne with a smile of innocent encouragement. "And one cannot help but wonder how even the smallest detail can hold meaning far greater than one might imagine." Peter, sitting quietly, looked at her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Miss Marple's gaze then shifted deliberately toward Lady Godfrey. "For instance," she continued, "a missing candelabra, an unexpected death, and a hastily written note left beneath a flower pot. All these incidents could suggest the hand of someone unfamiliar, someone who wishes to be unnoticed." The subtle tension in the room thickened. Lady Godfrey's gloved hands rested tensely on her lap, and Nicholas Gillingham's eyes flickered toward the fireplace, avoiding Miss Marple's penetrating gaze. Miss Marple continued, letting silence and observation serve as her allies, but she said softly, almost as though thinking aloud, "It is often not the newcomer, nor the most nervous, who orchestrates events, but rather someone whose life is intimately entwined with the household. Someone whose understanding of others' behavior allows them to manipulate suspicion with precision." All eyes turned, some reluctantly, some inquisitively, toward Miss Marple. Peter's expression remained steady, yet Miss Marple noted the small exhale of relief as he understood he was not the true focus. Lady Godfrey's lips tightened subtly, the first visible sign of internal agitation. Nicholas shifted slightly, a frown forming between his brows. Miss Marple paused to let her words settle, then picked up the note she had discovered days prior. "This note," she said, producing it from her reticule, "was left near the Vicarage Gate. Its wording was simple, yet the implications were significant. The writer expected secrecy, planned a meeting, and relied on the movements of others to mask their intentions." Her gaze settled on Lady Godfrey. "Do you recognize it?" she asked gently. Lady Godfrey's fingers trembled as she reached for her teacup. I do not know," she stammered, though the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression one of serene understanding. "Ah, but it was written in a hand familiar to you, was it not? And the meeting at the old elm? Why would a newcomer or even the gardener know of that place and the habits surrounding it? Only someone with intimate knowledge could predict where the note might remain unnoticed, yet observed." Nicholas shifted in his seat, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. Miss Marple's eyes met his. "And the candelabra," she continued softly, "taken so precisely that no trace of forced entry remained, yet moved when it would attract attention, an act calculated to direct suspicion toward the innocent. Tell me, Nicholas, why would you have taken such care to ensure Peter appeared guilty?" The room held its collective breath. Lady Godfrey's gloved hands tightened, and Nicholas's face paled, his previous composure dissolving under the weight of subtle observation and undeniable deduction. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, allowing the truth to settle like dust in the still air. Nicholas's voice, when it emerged, was barely above a whisper. I did not mean for it to... I only wanted him blamed. Not death," he confessed, the tremor in his words betraying long-suppressed guilt. "Mr. Cartwright." He discovered the discrepancies, the financial irregularities, and I feared exposure. Miss Marple nodded gently, her tone soft yet decisive. "Indeed. Your actions were guided not by anger or revenge, but by fear. Fear of discovery, fear of social disgrace. Yet the outcome was far graver than intended. You manipulated suspicion, relied on the village's eagerness to blame the unfamiliar, and even created a diversion with the theft of the candelabra. And yet, the truth is always revealed, not by confession alone, but by observation, by the pattern of human behavior that cannot be entirely concealed." Peter exhaled quietly, relief evident in his expression, while Lady Godfrey's eyes filled with a mix of shock and sorrow. Even the quieter villagers, who had participated only peripherally, now understood the careful orchestration behind the events that had shaken their small community. Miss Marple folded the note and returned it to her reticule. "The small details," she said, "often overlooked, sometimes dismissed, were the key. The note by the flower pot, the footsteps near the old elm, the subtle movements in the household, all led to the revelation that the true culprit was neither newcomer nor obvious suspect, but someone whose understanding of human nature allowed deception to flourish." Nicholas sank into his chair, words failing him as Miss Marple's gentle yet unwavering clarity left no room for denial. The quiet of the room seemed heavier now, a solemn recognition of human frailty, error, and the inevitable exposure of concealed truths. Miss Marple, serene as ever, sipped her tea, allowing the village to absorb the resolution. In St. Mary Mead, order would be restored. Yet the subtle lesson remained. Appearances deceive, the innocent may suffer suspicion, and the careful observation of human behavior reveals what even the most cunning cannot hide. The village of St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, though a subtle tension lingered in the air, like the aftertaste of a bitter tea. Windows were opened a little earlier, shutters fastened a little more securely, and the usual gossip that once seemed innocuous now carried an edge of caution. The events at the vicarage, the death, the theft, and the subsequent revelations had left their mark on the villagers' collective consciousness. Miss Marple, walking through the familiar lanes with her cane tapping softly against the cobblestones, observed the small changes with quiet satisfaction. The baker's shop smelled of fresh bread as always, but the line of villagers waiting to collect their morning pastries carried the weight of new awareness. Whispers passed like ripples, each softened by civility, yet sharper for the shared understanding that human nature was rarely as straightforward as it appeared. At the vicarage, Lady Godfrey had taken measures to restore order and propriety. The silver candelabra was returned to its rightful place, polished to a reflective gleam that seemed almost symbolic of restored integrity. Yet the lady herself moved with a slight restraint, her social composure intact, but subtly tempered by the recent revelations. The careful balance of manners and reputation, so fiercely guarded, had been rattled, and even she could not entirely dismiss the lessons learned from Nicholas Gillingham's deception. Nicholas, meanwhile, had retreated from the village's main social gatherings, seeking solitude and reflection. His confession had been received with a mix of disappointment and reluctant understanding. While the law would take its measured course, the villagers' judgment had already begun in quiet, deliberate whispers. Miss Marple noted with her habitual clarity that remorse often travelled slower than gossip, but lingered far longer in the human conscience. Peter Thorne, once a figure of suspicion, now moved freely among the villagers, his presence a quiet reminder of the dangers of hasty judgment. Miss Marple had ensured that no undue accusation persisted. His reputation, though briefly shadowed, had been restored. The newcomer's calm demeanour and consistent honesty had ultimately supported the subtle observations she had made during their tea, confirming the importance of careful scrutiny over assumption. In the quiet of her own home, Miss Marple reflected on the events. She arranged her knitting neatly on the table, a comforting routine that contrasted with the complexity of recent days. Her mind, however, remained engaged, retracing the delicate threads of motive, opportunity, and human behavior that had brought the truth to light. She considered the small note, the footsteps by the elm, the subtle hesitations in speech, and the carefully orchestrated diversions. Each had been a minor element on its own, yet together they formed a tapestry of deceit and revelation. The villagers, slowly adjusting to the restored equilibrium, began to understand that their own assumptions had shaped their perceptions. Many had seen Peter Thorne as the obvious suspect, blinded by his unfamiliarity, yet the true culprit had been one of their own. Miss Marple observed quietly as old grievances, petty rivalries, and long-concealed resentments became topics for gentle reflection rather than open confrontation. In St. Mary Mead, the social fabric had been tested but ultimately endured, strengthened by the lessons learned. Miss Marple also pondered the nature of fear and secrecy. In a village where everyone believed they knew each other, even the smallest deception could flourish, nurtured by silence and assumed trust. Yet she thought it was precisely this intimacy that allowed the truth to emerge. People reveal themselves not only through action, but through subtle inconsistencies, fleeting gestures, and the faint tremors of conscience that betray intent. The real crime, she knew, was rarely the act itself, but the hidden motivations and the web of human interactions that permitted it. Returning to her routine, Miss Marple attended her garden, examining the blooms with the same meticulous care she had applied to observing human behavior. Roses were trimmed, lavender tended, and the gentle rhythm of daily life provided a quiet counterpoint to the recent turbulence. In her mind, the vicarage and the village were like her garden. The visible surface could appear orderly, yet beneath lay roots that required attention, understanding, and occasionally careful intervention. Occasionally, a villager would approach, offering news or a polite query, unaware of the full scope of Miss Marple's awareness. She received these interactions with her usual grace, providing advice or small reassurances, all the while noting the subtleties in tone and posture that hinted at lingering unease or unspoken truth. Each interaction was a confirmation of the village's return to normalcy, yet a reminder that human nature remained as intricate as ever. As evening fell, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands. She reflected on the case with the serene clarity of one who understood both human frailty and resilience. In St. Mary Mead, lives would resume, routines would continue, and yet the quiet lessons of observation, patience, and insight would linger beneath the surface, shaping perceptions and relationships in ways the villagers might not consciously recognize. The vicarage, restored to its outward tranquility, stood as a testament to the delicate balance between appearance and reality. Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling faintly in the firelight, mused that in every village, as in every heart, there are secrets, motives, and truths waiting to be revealed, and it is only through patience, careful observation, and a gentle understanding of human nature that they come to light. In the soft glow of the evening, the village slept, and Miss Marple, ever vigilant yet quietly content, contemplated the enduring enigma of human behavior. In her world, no detail was too small, no gesture too fleeting, and no person beyond the reach of careful observation. In St. Mary Mead, life had returned to normal, yet with a subtle edge of awareness, a reminder that beneath the calmest surface, the currents of human nature were never truly still. The days that followed the revelation of Nicholas Gillingham's culpability were calm on the surface, yet in St. Mary Mead, the after-effects lingered like a subtle fragrance, pleasant to the senses yet impossible to ignore entirely. Villagers resumed their routines, yet the memory of recent events had left an indelible mark on the community. Every glance, every conversation, carried a quiet awareness that human motives were rarely straightforward, and that appearances, no matter how polished, could be deceiving. Miss Marple, as ever, continued her walks along the familiar lanes, exchanging polite nods with villagers who had once speculated and whispered so freely. She observed the slight hesitation in their steps, the careful calibration of their words, and the faint caution in their mannerisms. People were more mindful now, aware that even small actions could reveal hidden truths. It was a lesson they had learned without words, a subtle education in the art of observation, unspoken yet universally understood. At the vicarage, Lady Godfrey had resumed her social engagements with the familiar elegance that defined her character. However, there was now a reserved deliberation in her interactions, a conscious choice to be both vigilant and gracious. She had experienced firsthand the delicacy required to navigate social hierarchies and human ambitions, when trust was misplaced. The incident had reminded her subtly yet firmly that appearances were never sufficient to guarantee understanding. Nicholas Gillingham's demeanour had shifted entirely. He moved through the village quietly, reflective, and with a careful humility. The confession had been difficult, and the consequences, though measured by the law, were tempered by Miss Marple's insight and the villagers' understanding of circumstance. It was clear that guilt, tempered with remorse and the courage to confess, could restore a sense of balance even in the most disrupted lives. Peter Thorne, now comfortably integrated into the community, carried himself with a quiet assurance that arose from vindication. Miss Marple had, through her subtle observations and tests, ensured that the young man's innocence was recognized without exposing him to undue embarrassment. He had learned, perhaps, that justice need not always be immediate or overt. It often arrived in the careful, deliberate revelations orchestrated by those who understood both human nature and the art of patience. Miss Marple herself found satisfaction not in the resolution alone, but in the affirmation of her methods, the interplay of minor details, the note under the elm, the subtle hesitation of a hand, the minute inconsistencies in speech, had been enough to illuminate the path toward truth. She reflected on how small cues, overlooked by those engrossed in gossip or immediate assumptions, were often the very keys to unraveling the most intricate of human deceptions. The villagers, slowly acknowledging the lessons embedded within the events, began to interact with a renewed sense of discernment. Conversations carried an undercurrent of attentiveness, a subtle mindfulness that what one saw was not always what was true. Even in casual gossip, the recognition that actions and words could mislead, or conversely, reveal hidden motives, began to shape behavior in gentle but lasting ways. Miss Marple herself noticed these changes with quiet approval. The village was, in its essence, the same charming, close-knit community, yet now tempered by a wisdom that arose not from fear alone, but from the clarity that observation can provide. People were more aware of their own tendencies and those of their neighbours, more careful in their assessments, and perhaps a little more patient before passing judgment. In her own home, Miss Marple sat near the fire in the evenings, knitting and reflecting on the broader implications of the case. She considered how often the most ordinary people, in the most ordinary places, harboured thoughts, fears, and ambitions that could remain hidden for years. Yet in every human action, there were subtle signals, tremors of the heart, flickers of expression, slight deviations from routine that, if noticed, revealed the truth with unerring clarity. She recalled Mr. Cartwright's persistence in examining the vicarage accounts, Nicholas's intricate manipulation, Peter Thorne's cautious honesty, and Lady Godfrey's refined alertness. Each character had played a role in the unfolding drama, not as mere archetypes, but as complex individuals, each shaped by circumstance, morality, and personal perception. The case had reminded Miss Marple, as so many had before, that human nature is both fascinating and endlessly instructive, capable of great kindness and subtle deceit in equal measure. Even as life in St. Mary Mead settled into its accustomed rhythms, Miss Marple knew that the ripples of this episode would continue to influence the villagers. Minor disputes would be approached with greater care, small confidences handled with discernment, and casual judgments tempered by the understanding that the truth is often buried beneath layers of appearance and assumption. The lessons of observation, patience, and subtle inference were indelibly inscribed upon the village psyche. Though few would consciously articulate them, Miss Marple, quietly observing from her chair, recognized that in every community there are secrets, motives, and unspoken truths waiting to be uncovered. And while many will move through life unaware of the subtle signals surrounding them, those who observe carefully, who notice gestures, tones, and hesitations, hold the key to understanding the intricate tapestry of human behavior. As evening deepened and the village lights twinkled like faint stars along the lanes, Miss Marple sipped her tea, content in the knowledge that justice had been served, yet mindful that the study of human nature is never complete. There would always be new mysteries, new patterns to discern, and new opportunities to observe the delicate balance of trust, deceit, and revelation. In St. Mary Mead, life had returned to normal outwardly, yet beneath the calm surface, Awareness now flowed quietly among the villagers, and at the heart of it, Miss Marple remained the serene observer, ever ready to notice the smallest of details, for in them lay the most profound truths of human nature. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a rhythm once again, yet the shadows of recent events lingered like faint echoes in the corners of familiar rooms and along the winding lanes. Life had resumed its customary pace. Morning bells, the scent of fresh bread, children's laughter at play, and the subtle hum of conversation in the village square. Yet beneath the surface, the awareness of human complexity had taken root, quietly altering perceptions, judgments, and interactions. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite chair near the window, watched the village from the vantage point of serenity and understanding. The sunlight fell softly across her knitting, illuminating the neat stitches and the quiet order she brought to her surroundings. She reflected on the cases she had encountered in her long life, the small details she had observed, and the gentle art of discerning truth amid human imperfection. This case, she thought, had been no different. A murder, a theft, and a web of deception that required patience, insight, and careful attention to the nuances of human behavior. The vicarage, restored to outward normality, stood like a silent testament to both the fragility and resilience of social order. Lady Godfrey moved with her customary grace, though now tempered with a subtle vigilance. She understood, as did Miss Marple, that trust must be measured and observation must accompany it. Nicholas Gillingham, once so carefully hidden behind layers of charm and duplicity, had been brought to account for his actions. The confession had provided closure, and though some village conversations remained tinged with judgment, the atmosphere gradually softened, replaced by cautious reflection rather than overt suspicion. Peter Thorne, having weathered the storm of false accusation, was quietly welcomed into the village's fold. He moved among the residents with understated ease, his presence a gentle reminder that appearances can mislead, and that truth often emerges through careful observation rather than assumption. Miss Marple noted with faint satisfaction how his honest composure had aligned with the subtle psychological cues she had watched during her final test. The incidents, the death of Mr. Cartwright, the theft of the candelabra, and the orchestrated attempts to manipulate perception had all served as lessons in human behavior, not just for Miss Marple, but for the village as a whole. In her mind, the key lay always in the small, almost imperceptible details: a hesitation in speech, a fleeting glance, the precise timing of an action, or the slight tremor of conscience. The intricacies of human nature, she knew, could never be fully concealed, for every person leaves traces of truth in their words, gestures, and routines. As the evening light deepened and shadows lengthened across the lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the dualities of human life: kindness and malice, honesty and deceit, courage and fear. Each villager had played a role in the unfolding events, not as mere caricatures, but as individuals shaped by circumstance, emotion, and personal history. The threads of motive, opportunity, and intention were interwoven into a delicate tapestry, visible only to those willing to notice the subtleties, to observe without prejudice, and to interpret without haste. She thought of Mr. Cartwright, meticulous in his attention to detail, whose untimely death had set the village into a brief spiral of chaos. She thought of Lady Godfrey, who balanced social grace with underlying awareness, and Nicholas, whose fear and ambition had led him astray. Peter Thorne, despite suspicion, had remained steadfast in honesty, and the other villagers had each played their part, consciously or not, in the delicate dance of observation, suspicion, and revelation. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented sigh. Justice had been served, not through force or accusation alone, but through patient observation, gentle prompting, and an understanding of human nature that transcended mere appearances. She understood, as always, that life's lessons are rarely loud or immediate. They unfold gradually, leaving subtle impressions that shape future behavior and perception. Outside, the village was bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the early stars, a tranquil contrast to the tension of recent days. The streets, lined with familiar cottages, seemed both ordinary and extraordinary, a microcosm of human life with its hidden depths and quiet truths. Miss Marple's eyes followed the gentle movements of the villagers, noting the careful balance between habit and awareness, routine and reflection. In the calm of her home, surrounded by the gentle warmth of familiar surroundings, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons of St. Mary Mead. The story of murder, theft and revelation would become part of the village's collective memory, recounted in cautious whispers and polite conversation. Yet beneath those stories lay the more profound truths, that observation, patience, and understanding of human nature were the true instruments of justice. As she placed her knitting aside and allowed her thoughts to drift, Miss Marple smiled faintly. In every village, in every household, in every human heart, there were mysteries waiting to be discerned. Some would remain hidden, others revealed only to the patient observer. And in St. Mary Mead, as elsewhere, the rhythms of life would continue, enriched by awareness, tempered by experience, and illuminated by the quiet insight of one who saw what others missed. The night settled over the village, serene yet alive with subtle understanding. Miss Marple, ever composed and quietly observant, sipped her tea by the fire, content that order had returned, yet mindful that the complexities of human nature would always remain, waiting to be observed, understood, and, when necessary, gently revealed. And in that gentle quiet, St. Mary Mead resumed its ordinary life, carrying within it the extraordinary lessons of truth, observation, and the enduring skill of its most perceptive resident,